So I've switched back into our main level, and we're going to add a pause menu into the game so that when our players are in the middle of playing the game, they can get interrupted and they don't have to worry about running away or anything like that. So I'm going to scroll out so we can see our big canvas on the screen. And then down here where we have our game over object and a bit of text, if I activate that here, we can see our game over and our little bit of text. I'm actually going to duplicate this object. So we're going to duplicate our game over, and I'm going to rename this to be pause for our pause menu. We're going to activate this here as well. And now instead of it saying game over, we obviously don't want that. We're going to change the text to say game paused with an exclamation mark. Actually, that's kind of just fits in just there perfectly. So I'm going to move this up here a little bit. And also on this pause menu, we're going to add some buttons so that our players can actually do some things while they're playing the game. So we're going to go back up to our main layer, and we're going to right click on this and go to UI button. And I'm going to change the text on this button to say resume. And I don't want to move that down, I want to move the whole button down. So we'll move the button down to there. Then I'm going to duplicate our button and say that this one will say quit to main. And then we can click and drag this one down. And we'll duplicate it one more time. Click and drag it down, and then we'll change the text to say quit to desktop. Okay, so perfect. We've got our game pause screen all working here. So the first thing we're going to do is set up so that these buttons will actually do something. So we're going to need to create a pause menu script to do this. So we're going to go down to our scripts folder, and we're going to right click and create a new C# script that we will call pause screen. Wait for this to compile and open up here in MonoDevelop. Give it a second. Oh, there you go. It's flashing orange at me. So our pause screen is going to have a couple of different functions in it. I'm not going to delete our start and our update just yet because we're going to want to make use of them in a little while. But for the first thing we want to do is look at our three buttons that we have. So we have a public void resume game, and that'll be for letting our player get back into playing the game. We'll have a public void quit to main. Oh, we don't want that space in there. Quit to main, and that'll take us back out to the main menu. And then down here we have a public void quit to desktop. So on our quit to desktop, obviously we're going to have this again be application.quit, like that. On our quit to main, we're going to need to load up the main menu. So we're going to need to again include the scene management elements of our Unity engine. So Unity engine dot scene management, like that. So that we've included that, we can go to our quit to main, and we'll obviously need to know the name of our main menu as well. So we're going to create a reference to it up here. Actually, we don't need to create a reference because much like we did in our previous project, we know that our main menu is always going to remain the same. So we can just hard code that in here so that whenever our players are quitting out of the main menu, they're always going to the same thing. So we can just type in here scene manager dot load scene main menu, and we need to make sure that's exactly how we spelled main menu back here in the game. So we go to our scenes folder, we've spelled the exact same, and we've capitalized it the exact same. So that's all we want to do in our quit to main. And then finally we have our resume game. But to know how we're going to resume the game, we need to know how we're going to actually activate this pause screen. So you can imagine that when we're playing our game, we want our players to just be able to press a button which will pause the game, and then it'll activate this screen. So when we want to go back into the game, we want the game to, or we want our players to be either able to press the resume button here, or again be able to press a button on their keyboard, and it'll go back into the game and deactivate this screen. So the only thing we know for sure is that we want to deactivate that screen. So here we know that if we press the resume game button, we want it to grab the game object that this script is attached to and say set active false. So how are we going to be able to pause the game and bring the screen up? Well, the best way to do it will be to use our game manager. So our game manager is always constantly running, we know that. So what we can do is say, okay, on the game manager, wait and see if the player has pressed the button, and if the player presses the button that should activate our screen, then activate the pause menu. So let's do that first of all. So we're going to need a reference to the pause menu, of course. We're going to use public game object, just pause screen, like that. And then in our update loop here, we're going to wait for the player to press the escape button. So the escape button would be, it's a generally used button for pausing a game on computers in general. So we're going to say if input.getKey down keycode.escape. Now there's one other button that we also want to use. So if someone wants to pause the game, there's two things that they will generally try and press first of all before they try anything else. Those will be escape and obviously pressing the P button, because P for pause. So we're going to add the ability for our players to press pause, but previously when we've used if statements, up here we've said, okay, if our player is pressing space and the game is not active, then we're able to check something, and to do that we use these ampersand symbols for and. But what we want to do is say if the player presses escape or if the player presses P. So rather than having two completely different if statements, what we can do is just add in two little bars like that, which when you're coding in C# here, these two bars represent or. So much like these two ampersands represent and, these two bars represent or. So then we can say input.getKey down keycode escape or input.getKey down keycode.p. Perfect. So that's what we want our if statement to be. So now we're just checking to see if the player presses escape or if the player presses P. And if either of those things happen, then we say, okay, what we want to do is set our pause screen dot set active is true. So that'll activate our pause screen. But what if we want our players, or if our players have already paused the game and want to deactivate the screen? Well, in that situation, we'd obviously want to be setting our pause screen to be false. So instead of just setting our pause screen to be active like this, we're going to add an extra if statement above it, and we're going to say, okay, if our pause screen, that should have a small p, if our pause screen dot active self. So active self is a way of checking if an object is currently active within Unity. So what we're saying is if our pause screen is currently active, then what we want to do instead of activating the screen, we want to say pause screen dot set active false, like that. So then we're saying, okay, deactivate the pause screen if it's already active. Otherwise, so else, otherwise we want to set our pause screen to be active. So we want to set it to be true so that it activates. So let's go ahead and test this out now back in our game. So we have our pause screen all set up and we just need to hook it up in our game manager to do all this stuff. I should actually attach the pause script to our pause button here and hook up the buttons too while we're connecting things at the time being. So we'll go to our pause object in our game hierarchy and we're going to add the pause screen script to it. Then on these individual buttons we're going to create a new action on them when we click them, and we're going to click and drag our pause into that slot, and then on each individual button we're going to give them the right function. So pause screen will have resume first of all, then we'll go again for pause screen quit to main, then pause screen quit to desktop. Okay, so we've got those set up. Now let's go to our game manager. We now have our empty slot for our pause screen, so I'm going to click and drag that in here, and now we're going to hit play to play the game, and we'll see our pause screen will be activated by default. But at the moment I'm also able to move the character around within the world, which isn't very good. So we're going to take a look at that in a second. But let's first of all test out that our pausing and unpausing is working. So I'm going to hit escape, and there we go, our screen disappears. Hit it a few times, it turns on and off and on and off. We can hit P, and it does the exact same thing. And we can also hit the resume button to get rid of the pause menu. So that's all perfectly fine. But what about when we pause the game, and now I'm able to use my little paddle to move around the world, and I'm also able to fire the ball. So the ball can keep firing, and we can keep playing the game. That's not very good. That's not what we want to happen at all. So how do we make the game actually stop moving when the screen is activated? I'm going to disable the screen because we don't want it to be coming up as soon as we start playing the game. We want it to be deactivated by default. But we'll go back into our scripts, and what we're going to use is a thing called time.timescale. And the time.timescale controls what speed the game is currently running at. So basically what we do is here where we want to set our this line here where we're setting our pause screen to be active and we're wanting to pause the game, what we say is time.timescale equals 0. And what that'll do is it'll say, okay, we want to change the timescale that the game is currently running at to be 0. So by default in Unity, our time is running at 1, which means for every 1 second in the real world, 1 second on the computer passes by. If we set our timescale to be 0, what that means is for every 1 second in the real world, 0 seconds in the game will pass by. So it won't make anything move forward at all. But we're still able to do stuff within the game like manage pause menus and things like that. So if we're setting our timescale to be 0 when we pause it, we then want to set it to be time.timescale equals 1 when we unpause the game. And we put a little F afterwards because we need to make sure that our timescale is actually using a float number. And whenever we want to use a float number and there's some ambiguity because the computer won't magically know necessarily that a 1 isn't an int, we want to explicitly say that it's a float, so we put a little F after it. So that's why we're saying time.timescale equals 1F, and what that means is it'll go back to running in perfectly normal time. So if we're doing that when we unpause the game in our game manager, we need to do the same thing back in our pause screen. So here in our pause screen, when we resume the game, we're going to say time.timescale equals 1F. So that'll make sure the game goes back to being playing when we're actually go back from pausing the game. Okay, so let's test this out in the game itself. We'll start it rolling here while it compiles in the corner. And we'll start playing. We set the ball firing, and if I pause it, now you can see that our ball is frozen in place, and our score effect that shows the score value of the brick that we just destroyed is no longer being destroyed after 2 seconds. So the length of time that it stays there is being paused while we pause the game. And that's why we use time.timescale, because it freezes absolutely everything in the world in place. So now if we resume the game, you can see everything goes back into running. It continues counting down to 2 seconds to every object being destroyed. And we can see there that the button pressing worked for unpausing the game. So let's do the same with just pressing the button on the keyboard. It does the exact same thing. It makes us be able to control whether the game is moving or stuck in time. So perfect. That's working absolutely wonderfully for us. But there is one more little issue that's being caused. And that is, so we're playing our game, we pause, we get interrupted and do something else, and we go, okay, I've only got 1 life remaining, I might as well just start over again. So I go to quit to the main menu, I go to start the game, and now I start trying to play, and everything's frozen. It doesn't work. I try to move, nothing happens. I try to launch my ball, nothing happens, and I'm like, oh no, my game is broken, I don't know what's happening. What's happened is that when we paused our game, we set the timescale to be 0, and then we load it into a completely different scene. But when we load into a completely different scene, it still retains whatever timescale you set Unity to be working at. So the only way to fix this is to make sure that when we go do something else coming out of our... Actually, I'll just stop this running. When we go do something else coming out of our pause menu, when we quit to main or we quit to desktop, we want to make sure that we set our timescale to be back to 1F. And just to be absolutely sure that we don't accidentally do this somewhere else and cause some other errors, we also want to go to our game manager, and we'll go into our start function here in the game manager, and we're going to say, okay, set our timescale there to be 1f. So we know that no matter what happens, as soon as we start the game, we want our timescale to run at the speed that it should run at.